That night on the Tonight Show stage, Hugh Jackman finished reading the letter, set it down on the desk with both hands, and went completely still. Jimmy Fallon watched him from across the desk. Hugh Jackman wasn't moving, wasn't speaking. His eyes were fixed on something that wasn't in the room, something only he could see. Somewhere far behind the studio lights and the cameras and the 300 people who had come to watch a celebrity interview and were now holding their breath without knowing why. Jimmy leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping beneath the noise of the audience's confusion. "Hugh, hey, you okay?" Hugh Jackman didn't answer. He pressed one hand flat against the letter, slowly, deliberately. The way you press your hand against something you are afraid might disappear. It was a Wednesday night taping. March 2024. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Hugh Jackman was the guest, promoting a new film, a living legend in the middle of a career that had never once slowed down. The audience was warm and generous from the first moment he walked out. He moved the way he always moves, with that particular ease of a man who has spent 30 years being exactly comfortable in his own body, broad-shouldered, unhurried. The kind of physical confidence that reads as kindness rather than arrogance. The interview was going beautifully. They talked about the film. They talked about his training, about New York, about fatherhood. Jimmy was at his best, loose, funny, genuinely engaged. The band was tight. The energy in the studio was the particular warm electricity of a night when everything is working. And then Jimmy reached under the desk and slid an envelope across the surface. He said only, "Someone asked me to make sure you got this tonight." Hugh Jackman looked at the envelope. He looked at Jimmy. He picked it up. He read it once. Then he read it again. And then he went still in the way that the human body goes still when something has reached all the way down and touched the part of a person that the rest of the world never gets close to. Not performed stillness. Not the stillness of a man composing himself for the cameras, just stillness. The absolute kind. The kind that has no audience. Jimmy Fallon's hand moved toward his microphone and then stopped. The entire studio froze. The band didn't play. The director in the control room did not call for a cut to commercial. The audience, 300 strangers who had arrived expecting a cheerful Wednesday night, sat without making a sound. Some of them would say later that they weren't sure what they were watching. Was he upset? Was something wrong? Was Hugh Jackman, of all people, about to cry on a talk show couch? And then, very quietly, in a voice that his microphone caught perfectly, Hugh Jackman said a name that meant nothing to anyone in that studio. Thomas. He said it once, looking down at the letter. And that was all. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1993. Hugh Jackman wasn't always Hugh Jackman, global icon, the Wolverine, the man whose name alone fills stadiums. In 1993, he was 24 years old, newly arrived from Sydney, studying at the Western Australian Academy of Performing Arts with the particular hunger of a young man who believes entirely in something that the world has not yet agreed to believe in with him. He was good, and he knew it. But knowing it and proving it are different countries, and he was still a long way from home. In July of that year, he took a summer job to cover rent. Not acting work, just ordinary work. The kind that actors take between the life they are building and the life they already have. He was working 3 shifts a week at a community recreation center in Perth, running an after-school program for kids whose parents worked late. It was the kind of job that disappears from a famous person's biography. Too small, too quiet, too far from the story people want to tell about them. One afternoon in the middle of a rainstorm that kept all the kids inside, a boy named Thomas Greer, sat down at a table in the corner of the recreation room, and would not move. He was 11 years old, slightly built, with the kind of quietness that reads as shyness from a distance, but as something more serious up close. Hugh noticed him the way good people notice things. Not loudly, not with intervention, just with attention. He sat down across from him. Didn't say anything at first, just sat. Thomas Greer had been at the center for 3 weeks and hadn't spoken to another child once. The other staff had noted it, flagged it, moved on. Hugh sat at that table for 40 minutes. What Thomas told him that afternoon, Hugh would carry for 31 years. The boy's father had died 8 months earlier. Sudden cardiac event. 42 years old, a Thursday morning before school. Thomas had been the one who found him. He was 10 years old when that happened, and now he was 11, and the world had continued in the way that the world continues. School, meals, the recreation center after school, and he had no language for what was living in his chest. Hugh Jackman was 24 years old, and he had no training for this, no qualification, no framework. He had only the instinct of a person who has been paying attention his whole life. He asked Thomas what his father was like. Thomas talked for an hour. They met at that table every afternoon for the rest of that summer. They talked about Thomas's father, about the things he had said, the things he had promised to teach Thomas that he never got the chance to teach him, the particular grief of an unfinished conversation. Hugh would come in after his shift sometimes, already changed out of his staff shirt, and sit at that table anyway. He taught Thomas how to throw a proper punch, something his father had been about to teach him. He sat through 2 school holiday screenings of films he had already seen. He never once made the boy feel like a project. On the last day before Hugh left Perth to return to Sydney, he brought Thomas a letter. He had typed it on a borrowed typewriter in his flatmate's kitchen at 11 o'clock the night before. 4 pages, single-spaced. Everything he had not managed to say out loud across that entire summer. Everything he wanted Thomas to know about grief, about fathers, about what it means to carry someone forward in the way you live. He folded it into an envelope and wrote on the outside, "For when you need it." Thomas Greer kept that letter. He kept it in the way that certain things are kept, not in a drawer, not in a box, but close. He read it at 18 when he left home. He read it at 23 when he got married. He read it when his first son was born, and he named that son James, and he told James about a young man from Sydney who once sat across a table from him in a recreation center during a rainstorm and decided to stay. Hugh Jackman went back to Sydney, and the world eventually agreed with what he already knew. The years filled with everything that years fill with. The roles, the theaters, the films, the name that became something larger than a person. Thomas Greer watched from a distance the way people watch people who were once briefly close to them. He never reached out. Their time had been what it was, complete in itself, and he understood that. He built a quiet and full life in Perth. He taught secondary school English for 22 years. He coached his son's football team. He attended one Hugh Jackman film every single year, the opening weekend, always alone, always in the same seat near the back where nobody would see an ordinary man sitting in the dark with something complicated on his face. Then, 8 months ago, Thomas Greer received a diagnosis, stage 3 colorectal cancer, spreading. His doctors were cautiously optimistic about treatment. His family was rallying. And Thomas Greer, sitting in an oncologist's office at 51 years old, made a decision that had nothing to do with optimism or caution. He went home, and he wrote a letter. He sent it to a management address he found after 20 minutes of searching. He did not expect a response. He said so in the letter, "I am not writing because I need anything. I am writing because I kept yours, and I thought you should know that it worked. I thought you should know what that summer was, from where I was sitting." The letter arrived. It was read. And Hugh Jackman, sitting in an office in New York with a script on his desk and 3 meetings before lunch, read it twice, set it down, and canceled the rest of his day. Behind the scenes, Hugh Jackman had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He called Jimmy Fallon's team directly, not through the usual channels, directly. One call, a simple request. He was coming on the show in 3 weeks to promote the film. He needed something arranged. He needed a man named Thomas Greer, flown from Perth to New York, put up in a hotel, and placed in the studio audience on the night of the taping. He needed Jimmy to hold a letter, the letter, Thomas's letter, and slide it across the desk at the right moment, without explaining what it was. The Tonight Show producers were told only that a guest of Hugh's would be in the audience, and that a prop would be incorporated into the interview. They were given the envelope. They asked no questions, because the request came with a particular quiet certainty that made questions feel beside the point. Thomas Greer landed at JFK on a Tuesday morning, having told his family he was going on a short trip. He had not told them why. He sat in a midtown hotel room on Tuesday night, then Wednesday morning, then Wednesday afternoon, and did not call anyone. He watched the city from a window on the 14th floor. He was not nervous in the way people are nervous before exciting things. He was something quieter than that. Hugh Jackman did not see him before the taping. That was by design. Now the studio understood nothing. They saw a man on a couch who had stopped being a man on a talk show couch. They saw Jimmy Fallon watching him with the focused care of a person who has set aside every professional reflex. They saw Hugh Jackman with one hand pressed flat against a letter that had traveled 31 years to reach him. He looked up from the letter slowly. He scanned the audience once, and then again, and then he found him. Thomas Greer, 51 years old, sitting in the 4th row, his hands folded in his lap, watching. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Hugh Jackman stood up. He did not ask permission. He did not look at Jimmy, did not look at the cameras, did not acknowledge the 300 people whose eyes followed him as he stepped around the desk and walked directly into the audience. He walked down the aisle with the particular directness of a man who has only one destination. Thomas Greer stood up before Hugh reached him. The way you stand up when you recognize something coming toward you that you have been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. They stood facing each other in the aisle for a moment that the cameras held without cutting. Hugh spoke first. His voice was low and slightly unsteady, the voice of a man who has rehearsed nothing. "You wrote to me." Thomas nodded once. "You kept mine," Hugh said. 31 years. "I kept it every day," Thomas said. His voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when a person has made peace with something long before the moment arrives. Hugh reached out and gripped the back of Thomas's neck with one hand, the specific gesture of a man reaching for someone he has known, not someone he is meeting. And Thomas pressed his forehead briefly against Hugh's shoulder, and then straightened up, the way people straighten up when they have permitted themselves exactly the amount of feeling they prepared for, and not one drop more. Jimmy Fallon had walked off the set. He was standing in the aisle 3 rows back, not directing anything, not performing anything, just standing with his arms crossed and his head slightly down, trying not to make sound. "I have a son," Thomas said. "I named him James." Hugh Jackman was quiet for a moment. He looked at Thomas with the complete attention that some people are capable of, and most people only manage in crisis. Then he said, "Tell me about him." The audience rose. Not all at once, the way things actually happen. In a wave, one person and then the next. The way genuine feeling moves through a room of strangers. Questlove had set down his drumsticks. A camerawoman in the far aisle was not looking through her viewfinder. The director in the control room had told his assistant, quietly, "Don't touch anything." Hugh Jackman turned to face the audience once. Just once, with the particular expression of a man who did not plan to be standing where he is standing and is not sorry about it. Then he turned back to Thomas Greer. Thomas Greer flew back to Perth on Thursday morning. His treatment continued through the autumn, and by December his doctors were using the word responding. His son James, who had grown up hearing the story of a rainstorm and a recreation center and a borrowed typewriter, watched a clip of that Wednesday night on his phone in his university dormitory in Melbourne and called his father immediately. The letter Hugh had written in 1993, the one Thomas had kept for 31 years, the one that had traveled from Perth to Sydney to New York and back to Perth, is now framed on a wall in Thomas's classroom, where he still teaches English 3 days a week. His students know the story. He tells it every year at the start of term, not because it is about Hugh Jackman, but because of what he tells them it is actually about. Some letters take 31 years to arrive, but they always arrive exactly on time.